All right, thanks, Kevin. Hear me okay?
Sounds good.
Okay, great. Well, thanks for the invite, and I just want to provide a brief overview of a statewide project that we are working on. That extension led with a number of farmer cooperators through the nitrogen optimization pilot program, and we will provide that some data based on some of those locations that we have across the state. This is not going to be comprehensive. There's a lot of data that we're still slogging through. And again, this is just the first year of this project, so we'll just provide some of that overall detail. So the objective of our program was to evaluate the effect of manure and commercial nitrogen on corn yield. And that is both with corn silage as well as corn for grain. And we'll share some of the results of that first year on both of those commodities in terms of what we've seen so far with our project. The other part of this is to estimate some potential nitrate leaching. And so we've worked with Stephen Hall, who you will hear from after my talk here about what we're learning from our projects across the NOPP with the potential nitrate issues going related to groundwater. Here in western Wisconsin, the three counties I work in, nitrate is an issue in groundwater, as you saw from the map that Lindsay shared. And so again, it's one that we've added into our project just to see if we can get a handle on what might be slipping away from that root zone. And then, of course, to add to the UW-Madison database for any future nitrogen rate recommendations, especially as we relate to commercial nitrogen or any of the impact that manure may have on that, and boil that down to the manure crediting side of things. So I just wanted to thank the extension team as we rounded this group up last year as we started our project in the spring of 2024. So a number of cooperators and extension folks reached out to coordinate this, but we had Chris Clark in the Northeast as well as Liz Gartman, kind of along that Fond du Lac, Sheboygan area. Again, like I said, Stephen Hall's been a big part of our water quality component to this. Jordan's been kind of our facilitator with this as we move through the grant process and moving, making sure everything's being taken care of on that end. And then Josh Camps down in the South Central, Scott Royce over in the Northeast. And then you've just heard from Lindsay as our outreach specialist. And then Monica Showers, our research director, who really handles all of that, the data part of this. And so just to give you a snapshot where we are around the state, we had it pretty well covered, maybe missing one here or two sites, maybe across the central part of the state. But for the most part, those dots you see in green are grain sites. So we had 4 corn grain sites and then 3 corn silage sites. We won't talk about all these today as there's a lot more detail in terms of the data coming out, but we'll share some of the high level things that we've observed here in this first year with corn as well as the corn silage. So to kind of explain what we've been doing, it is a 2-year project. We had 7 sites in 2024. We have 5 sites this year. We lost a couple of cooperators this year just due to the crop rotation, field availability, those kind of things. As any of us that deal with on-farm research know, we can. It's not as controlled as we maybe have at a research station, but again, we did lose a couple of sites for 2025, but should be able to draw some conclusions after having over 12 to 15, 20 sites of data across these 2 years. And so we did have a split plot replicated design with manure, without manure. So in most cases, we had 2 strips with manure, 2 strips without manure, replicated our commercial nitrogen rates across those. So we had that randomization and replication built into the design. We used field and farmer specific manure rates. Again, working on farm research, we wanted to make it as friendly with our farmer cooperators as possible. So those manure rates were not specific. We went with what their normal application rate would be and then adjusted our manure credits based on the manure tests and then adjusted those rates accordingly with the synthetic nitrogen rates. So basically, we looked at 6 rates. We had the 0, and then with the MRTN, we pretty much followed what the farmer would do as a side dress application. So maybe it wasn't a true MRTN rate, but it was what that farmer was using in his normal cropping system. And then we went plus or minus 40 or 80 pounds. So across the state, we tried to follow this protocol as close as possible to get the data. And that's where we're glad to have Monica along to kind of sort through some of the idiosyncrasies, the little nuances that each site does bring with it. And then finally, we had lysimeters installed in one location. That's the field you see on the top part in Chippewa County here. In 2024, we just removed those, and Stephen will maybe go into some of that detail here following this talk. And then 2025, we've repeated that. So we dug out those lysimeters in this spring that were installed last year and reinstalled some new ones in the new plot. And so the plot you're seeing on the map on the screen here, this side over here is the 2024 site. Basically, 2025 is over on this side for this year. Same field, just a different, we moved over just a few feet. So those lysimeters, we're hoping will give us some consistent detail. So what happened? So when we look at this across all from a grain site, again, those 4 sites that we had that we harvested for grain, we got, again, with 6 different rates that we have across the commercial nitrogen rates, you can see we did find the curve. That's what we try for anytime we do nitrogen rate trials, to see if we can find that curve. And so the economic nitrogen rate was based on a nitrogen corn price ratio of 0.1. And so you can see somewhere across the state, our 4 sites that had grain, we found the curve around somewhere in that 150 to 180 pounds of nitrogen rate, depending on the site-specific part of it. So we did find the curve in terms of the overall grain yield, in terms of what with manure and without manure. And what you'll see across some of these sites is that the manure did provide a slight bump in some of the yield. Not all sites, but overall we did see that bump with manure, bringing along maybe some of those extra nutrients that we account for in crediting. So we'll first start at Rock County. Again, this was a slurry manure that was applied in the spring, again, but just on those manure designated plots, and there was no cover crop involved. So the manure that was applied was specific to those plots that were going to either be with manure or without manure, as well as again, all receiving those same rates across the commercial nitrogen rates. So what you see in this yield chart here is that the economic N rate was a little lower for our commercial rates compared to the manure rate. Now, this is the one site where we saw manure with a little bit higher economic N rate, or excuse me, a lower yield along with that higher economic N rate. So again, looking at this, as we know, we have a lot of variability within fields, a lot of variability within manure. We did manure testing to see where how much nutrient is actually being applied on these plots. So what's interesting with this slurry that this farm used in Rock County, you can see there's quite a bit of total nitrogen that was part of the analysis. And you can see that this was a kind of almost a semi-solid slurry that was used, so a little bit higher dry matter, 20% dry matter, 80% moisture. So we did see a little bit higher total nitrogen, especially in this organic nitrogen, and you may see that could be why that was not mineralized completely when we look at that yield curve in terms of the effect that the manure had on it. Again, we did about 2 or 3, depending on the location, we did 2 to 3 different manure samples just to make sure we were looking, getting as much data as we can rather than just taking one sample and applying that across all the sites or across all of that location. We did take a couple of different manure samples to make sure we were somewhat consistent in what was being applied. And you can see on this second manure analysis, we were pretty close to that, very consistent, again, around that 20% dry matter, but again, a higher organic nitrogen component as well. So when we go back to this chart, we can kind of see maybe that higher organic nitrogen rate might be why this yield is maybe a little lower, simply because maybe all of that nitrogen was not mineralized at that point. Looking at Chippewa County, again, this was again we got funded in spring, January or spring of 2024. The farmer that we worked with here in Chippewa County had already applied fall manure across that whole field. So in the spring, we put it on just those designated plots as an extra application. There was a rye cover crop out there, very little biomass at the time of termination. So again, we took some biomass measurements, but it was not significant to affect some of the nitrogen uptake. Here, kind of the reverse of Rock County, you saw the economic N rate a little higher with a little bump in the yield compared to the synthetic nitrogen in this case. But the big difference here is when you look at this manure, very, very high in water content. The moisture content around 95%, dry matter about 5%. So again, we see quite a bit less organic nitrogen compared to the Rock County site. And so there might be more of that manure available early on in terms of the ammonium and maybe not being mineralized maybe a little bit quicker from that standpoint. Same thing again, took another, these are the two manure analysis, again, pretty consistent across the board, looking at maybe a little bump here in the organic nitrogen, but overall a very liquid type of manure that was there. One thing that we did do is take a post-harvest soil nitrate test. And so this again shows some differences with the N rates at both depths. Kind of like what Josh was talking about, that's why we look at weather. If we all remember what last fall was like, we know it was very dry, September through October. And so we could see some difference in how much nitrate is still available in that 1 to 2 foot range in that soil profile. So you can see there was a significant difference between the N rates at both depths. So again, the zero is much lower than what we saw at these higher rates, whether it was with manure or the synthetic fertilizers. Again, the 1 to 2 foot rates are all differ from one another with increasing soil nitrate rates. Again, these continue to climb. So when we look at ammonium, as we look over here with that 0 to 1 foot range, there's quite a bit of ammonia still left in that 1 to 2, or excuse me, 0 to 1 foot range on that manure that's being applied. Again, is it a result of the weather being as dry as it was, not as much mineralized over time? We're just pulling this one out since we simply had the data from Chippewa County to work through, but all of our sites had this data to work with in terms of some of the post-harvest nitrate and ammonium, and that can help explain a few things as we start to maybe tell this story of how manure and commercial nitrogen interact.
Jerry, we did have someone post in the chat, what's the origin of the manure? And I believe you stated this was dairy manure, correct?
Correct. They're all dairy manure. Correct. Yep.
Okay, thank you.
That's a great question, though, Kevin. I'll just back up to this Chippewa site. This is separated a little bit on this site here. There is not a composter, but it's a big drum process that does pull out some of the solids from this, so that from the manure. So therefore, you get this lower dry matter. But yes, these are all dairy farms.
Thanks.
So then, as we move into corn grain yield in Oconto County, we don't have as much of the agronomic background data to this, but it's very interesting what we saw where there was manure and no manure. The manure definitely a flat line across that economic N rate, didn't really need any more where the manure was. And I think what's impressive is seeing, these higher rates or these higher yields, even where we have zero commercial nitrogen applied. So again, these maybe more northern soils, manure definitely has maybe a larger impact as maybe some of the southern sites, simply because we have those different soil types that can take advantage of that yield with that manure. So more to come from this site specifically, but very interesting what we look at from the impact that manure had. We did find the curve with the commercial nitrogen rate, but again, a little higher than maybe what we would see in some of the more northern soils. So overall, with those sites, again, what we saw was manure having a little bit of an impact on yield as we went across the different treatments. with manure, without manure. So we saw manure do a little bit, obviously a bump in yield when we looked at each of these at an economic N rate. But also what's impressive is some of the yields that we're seeing, even with a zero synthetic nitrogen rate, and if it's a credit from the manure, from maybe that first or second year manure credit coming back, we could be seeing an influence of that as well. So kind of interesting from that standpoint. We'll switch to silage quick here. Again, liquid manure, dairy manure applied in the fall of 2023 across the whole site. So this site in Walworth County was just looking at the different rates of synthetic nitrogen. But you can see as we added more nitrogen, it really didn't matter to that yield. It did affect maybe over here on the moisture side of things. Maybe things stayed greener a little bit longer from that standpoint. But overall yield, we really didn't see that difference with adding synthetic nitrogen. The manure was holding, keeping things productive from that standpoint. Again, a couple things just on the quality side of things. We had our highest yield actually, not a lot of difference statistically here, but that zero N rate still provided quite a bit of everything we needed from that standpoint. There's also looking at starch with a lower rate as well. Maybe we had a little bigger ear here in terms of some of the grain content of that corn silage. And finally, we'll wrap up with Washington County composted manure, again applied in the spring. This was the one site where we really didn't hit the top of the curve over here. It didn't curve like we thought it would, or kind of planned to with these nitrogen rates. But again, this was kind of a high variable field with a lot of uneven emergence due to some heavy wet weather in the spring. And so only two reps were really pulled of the data to keep it consistent with what the field was delivering. So this is kind of what it looked like. You could see a lot of variability out there as well. So then the corn silage yield, looking at the manure again, this kind of falls in between the other two sites that we had some manure data on, looking at about a 10% dry matter type of, again, dairy manure out there, but higher in that organic matter, which may be releasing a little bit later over time. And so looking at it from that standpoint, kind of one that fell in between those two that we've already looked at. So again, making sure we have good manure analysis to make our decisions on this. So again, going back to Washington County with silage, seeing that it was still climbing, it was the one where we really didn't find that upper end to the production side of things, but we did see quite a bit of yield from the zero rate. So as I wrap up here, the manure application overall slightly increased that corn and silage yield across all those sites compared to just the synthetic nitrogen alone. The type of manure is heavily influencing that N availability, whether that was, especially when you have a drier fall like that, seeing some of that nitrogen still being held in that top foot of soil. The zero rate of nitrogen was the highest or equal yield in two of the locations where we had manure applied. Again, that was that Burnett and Oconto County site. And then the highest N rate resulted in the highest yield only in that one location, and that was that corn silage in Washington with that high variability. So our next steps, we're going to wrap up this 2024 data soon, and then we'll see what happened in 2025. And then hopefully we'll get some data that can be provided to UW for some of the NRECs, and then we'll have a new NOPP proposal, hopefully funded in 26 and 27. So any growers or farmers out there interested in working on manure with this project, just get a hold of us in Extension, and we'll see if we can round up a spot for you. Finally, what we're going to do is a resin lysimeter, and that's where we're going to turn it over to Stephen, as that was something we did have installed here in Chippewa County, and I'm not going to steal any of Stephen's thunder. So appreciate that, and I'll stop sharing. If you have any questions, please reach out.